Hey, good afternoon, Trondheim friends. It's Pastor Sue, and welcome to this week's episode of Patio Ponderings. And today my patio is inside. I'm in the sanctuary of Trondheim Lutheran Church up by the altar. Because we are in the midst of a sermon series on the Ten Commandments, and our most recent sermons have been on what we call the loving God commandments, the first couple of commandments that teach us how to be in relationship with God in loving ways. And so I'm talking about the commandments that tell us to not have any other gods but God, and to use God's name with respect, or in the traditional translation, do not use God's name in vain. And so I thought this would be an appropriate place to do some pondering about the verses that tell us the story of the giving of those particular commandments, because this is indeed a place where we come to worship and to show our commitment and our love for God. Now, in the middle of the giving of these commandments, there's a verse here that tends to trip us up. And when I did my sermon on this, I did a little bit of work on it. And this is, let's hear the verse first. It's Exodus 20, verse 5. And it says this: I punish children for their parents' sins, even to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. So in the middle of talking about the Ten Commandments as being about love for God and love for neighbor, and understanding that we do that because God first loved us, this verse feels very dissonant. It doesn't seem to ring true with the rest of our conversations, with the rest of the nature of what the Ten Commandments are calling us to. So I did a little work on this verse for my sermon, and I talked about the idea that when we turn away from God, when we turn away from love, violence and evil fill that space, and there's consequences to that. And the consequences of living like that are that we pass those ways of living down to our children. I'm not sure this felt entirely satisfactory to me or to anybody, and actually I know it didn't feel entirely satisfactory to our confirmation kids, because I still heard some really interesting questions on it and some wonderings about it on their sermon notes. And so I went back and have done a little more pondering on this verse. You know, in a tradition, a Christian tradition, which we talk so much about grace, hearing about punishment for sins, it just doesn't feel right. Okay, so just a little bit of a geek alert here. What I did is went back to the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, and also the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and really looked at pieces of this verse. And here's what I think is going on that makes us so uncomfortable, and maybe we can put this in a little different perspective. So when we hear this verse, I think this is what we hear. I punish children for their parents' sins. I think that's what we hear, and we stop. And what we miss, and what I think is so crucially important, is the very last phrase. The sins of the parents, those who hate me. Okay? And that's what I really started to dig into. And it's that word hate that kind of cracked this open for me a little bit. When we talk about hate in this context, it is similar to how we talk about love. Hate and love here are not feelings, they're actions. These are verbs, okay? So they're not feeling words, they're doing words. When we talk about loving God and loving neighbors, we expect or we understand that that kind of love is to be acting, to doing things that are loving. And that is what is true about this word hate, okay? The nuance of this word hate here in the Hebrew and the Greek have to do with detest. There's a nuance of persecution. And in some cases, it means to pursue with hatred. So when we're not talking simply about anyone who sins, that the children are going to be punished for their parents' sins, only of those who hate God. And these are people who are actively opposed to God. And those who are actively opposed to God are acting not out of love, but out of hate, out of apathy. They're not acting out of good, they're acting out of evil. So what I think is happening here is God is making it clear that when evil arises, when people not only just fail to do the commandments, but actively do the opposite of the commandments, and that evil comes of that, and God is going to actively oppose that evil because it has consequences for the generations to come. And I think in an interesting way, that's good news, isn't it? If there's evil in the world, we want God to work against that. We want God to take out that evil. So I think that's more the tenor of this verse. And so when we hear this, we need to hear it in its entirety, that it's not just the sins of the parents that get punished. It's the sins of the parents who hate God. We have to hear that as a whole and understand that this is an active force against God in the world, and that God is not going to let that stand. So wondering what you think about that idea. Again, maybe this still isn't satisfactory. Maybe it still doesn't feel resolved. And we've had to talk about this quite a bit lately, it seems, that when we encounter some of these stories in the Bible, sometimes we can't find a comfortable way for these stories to sit and to feel right to us. And you know what? We've got to let that be okay. And we'll come back to it another time, and maybe we'll have some other insight. So again, as always, would love to hear what you have to say. Have a great day. Don't forget to turn your clocks back this week, and we'll see you Sunday. Bye.